The laughter began in polished rooms filled with maps, cigars, and uniforms heavy with medals. German officers, their eyes fixed on sweeping arrows across European charts, often smirked when reports of American logistics filtered through. They thought war was measured in tanks, artillery, and the grim arithmetic of divisions. What could possibly be heroic about trucks? To them, supply vehicles were dull silhouettes on dusty roads, fragile machines suited for peacetime farmers or merchants, not soldiers. A true war machine, they insisted, was iron-plated, bristling with cannons, and fueled by intimidation. Trucks. Trucks were background noise, something easily crushed beneath the steel treads of a panzer. The Germans were engineers of terror. The Americans, in their view, were delivery men pretending to fight a war. Yet beneath that smug dismissal lay a blindness that would cost them dearly. The truth, whispered in the corridors of Allied planning rooms, but invisible to the Reich's elite, was that wars were not won by firepower alone. They were won by movement. Movement demanded fuel, food, ammunition, and spare parts. Without those, even the fiercest army collapsed into stranded men clutching empty rifles. And while the Wehrmacht had dazzled the world with blitzkrieg, slicing across Poland and France in weeks, it had done so with supply lines stretched to breaking, wagons pulled by horses clattering behind sleek tanks. Yes, horses. For all their mechanized pride, German divisions still relied on millions of animals to haul supplies. In contrast, America looked to something else, an army of wheels. Imagine the irony. When the US declared war, it did not have the mighty tank fleets of Germany nor the battle-hardened soldiers of Britain. What it had was industry, sprawling factories, endless highways, and an obsession with production. In Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland, the assembly lines that once delivered sedans and tractors retooled to churn out military trucks at a dizzying pace. The weapon was not glamorous, not wrapped in sleek steel or fitted with guns. It was the GMC CCKW, known simply as the Deuce-and-a-Half, a 2.5-ton supply truck with no armor, no glory, and no intimidation factor. To German eyes, it was laughable. To American planners, it was salvation. From the deserts of North Africa to the hedgerows of Normandy, the Deuce-and-a-Half and its siblings carried everything. Fuel in sloshing barrels, crates of K rations, boxes of ammunition, spare engines, and even coffins. Soldiers clung to their wooden sides as the trucks bounced through mud, snow, and dust storms. They were ugly, noisy, and often uncomfortable, but they moved. Always moving, always arriving, always connecting. One American colonel famously quipped, "Battles are won by infantry, but wars are won by logistics." That statement would be tested most brutally in the campaign that came after D-Day. When the Allies clawed their way onto the beaches of Normandy, they faced not only the entrenched German army, but also the vastness of France itself. Bombed-out railroads crippled traditional supply. Ports were clogged or destroyed. And yet, by summer's end, an army of trucks roared inland, carrying millions of gallons of fuel and countless tons of ammunition. German generals stared at the reports with disbelief. The Americans were not slowing down. They were accelerating. There was a phrase that haunted Axis intelligence, the Red Ball Express. It sounded almost trivial, like a circus act. In reality, it was the name of the most audacious supply operation in modern warfare. Day and night, convoys of trucks thundered down hastily marked routes across France, drivers barely out of their teens gripping wheels with white-knuckled determination. Painted with a red ball insignia, these convoys carried the lifeblood of the Allied advance. The Germans tried to strangle it with ambushes, air attacks, and sabotage. But still, the trucks kept coming, mile after mile, hour after hour, a tide of movement that no strategy could stop. German officers had scoffed, but by autumn of 1944, their mockery had curdled into fear. Because while they measured victory in tanks, the Allies measured it in gallons of fuel delivered, in crates unloaded, in wheels that never stopped turning. The humble supply truck was transforming into the most dangerous weapon of all, inevitability. The Red Ball Express was not born from luxury or abundance, but from desperation. In the late summer of 1944, Allied armies broke out of Normandy and surged across France faster than even their own planners had anticipated. It was supposed to take months. It took weeks. Cities fell like dominoes, villages cheered liberation, and armored columns drove so fast that they often outran their maps. But victory posed its own problem: fuel. Patton's tanks, Montgomery's divisions, and Bradley's armies all required oceans of gasoline. A Sherman tank drank 2 gallons every mile. A fighter plane needed hundreds just to take off. Ammunition ran in the tens of thousands of tons, food in the millions of rations. If supplies stalled, so too would liberation. Railroads were shattered. Bridges had been blown sky high. The French infrastructure, already bleeding from years of occupation, could not bear the burden. There was only one solution: trucks, tens of thousands of them. And so the Red Ball Express roared into existence. The name came from American railroads, where red ball marked priority freight that must never stop. Painted circles marked the convoy routes across France, highways reserved solely for military supply. No civilian traffic, no hesitation, only relentless motion. Day and night, drivers pushed forward, often with blackout lights that barely glowed in the dark. German planes hunted them, strafing convoys at dawn. Snipers lurked near forest roads. Tires burst on cratered highways, engines overheated, brakes gave way on steep hills. But the trucks kept coming. Each one carried roughly 5,000 pounds of supplies. Multiply that by thousands of trucks running non-stop, and the numbers became staggering. In a single day, the Red Ball Express delivered over 12,000 tons of fuel and ammunition. To German officers staring at dwindling maps of retreat, it felt as though the Allies had conjured factories on wheels. The drivers were often young, many just 19 or 20, plucked from farms and cities in the United States and thrust into the heart of Europe's chaos. Nearly 3/4 were African-American soldiers, men segregated from their white counterparts in training, but thrust into the same dangers once the engines roared. History would later forget their faces, but in 1944, their courage was written on every mile of French road. They nicknamed themselves truck-borne infantry because every journey was a battlefield. A driver recalled one night when German artillery bracketed his convoy. He pressed the accelerator, praying the barrels of gasoline behind him wouldn't ignite. "We didn't fight with rifles," he later said, "but every load was a weapon. And if it didn't get through, someone at the front would die." To the infantry slogging through mud and the tankers pushing eastward, those trucks became more than machines. They were lifelines. Soldiers spoke of hearing the rumble of engines before dawn and knowing hot food, fresh ammunition, or even letters from home were near. That sound meant momentum, and momentum was hope. One GI remembered how exhausted men would cheer as convoys rattled into camp, headlights cutting through the night. It was like Christmas morning every time. The Germans tried to mark this obsession with logistics. Propaganda broadcasts sneered that Americans were mechanized grocers, hauling supplies, as though war was a shopping trip. But on the ground, their soldiers knew the truth. Fuel shortages strangled the Wehrmacht. Tanks abandoned in fields, trucks left rusting on roadsides, aircraft grounded on empty airstrips, all because supply lines had failed. Meanwhile, American forces seemed to multiply. A division could advance 100 miles, halt only briefly, then push forward again, supplied by the endless flow of trucks. Contrast defined the battlefield. Where Germans still hitched wagons to horses, Americans sent convoys hundreds of vehicles long. Where German fuel arrived in dribbles, Allied armies received rivers of gasoline. And where German officers scoffed at trucks as unworthy of war, they now cursed them as the very engine of defeat. The battlefield had become a contest not of who fired the biggest shell, but of who could move faster, longer, and farther. By September 1944, The Red Ball Express had delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies. Patton himself declared that without those trucks, his army would have starved in the field. German generals who had once smirked at the thought of American logistics were beginning to realize they were not fighting just an army. They were fighting a machine powered by wheels, gasoline, and the relentless as the convoys rolled deeper into France. The Red Ball Express became not just a lifeline, but a legend whispered through foxholes and command tents alike. The Germans, who had once boasted of their superior engineering, now faced a reality that gnawed at their confidence. Their tanks still bristled with firepower, their artillery thundered across valleys, but increasingly these weapons sat idle, trapped by emptiness, no fuel, no shells, no bread for the soldiers waiting at the front. For all their discipline, the German army could not conjure supplies out of thin air. America, on the other hand, had built a system where trucks were as vital as rifles. Every mile east was another challenge. Roads cratered by bombs twisted into mud during autumn rains. Bridges had been dynamited by retreating Germans, forcing engineers to lash together makeshift spans in hours. Drivers faced exhaustion, often running 20-hour shifts with barely any rest. Stories spread of men tying belts to steering wheels to keep themselves from slumping forward into sleep. Some swore they drove hallucinating, seeing phantom headlights on empty roads or hearing voices in the wind. Yet still they pressed on. There was no alternative. The advance depended on them. To the Germans, it seemed almost supernatural. Reports captured from field units described American trucks that arrive in endless lines, as if factories follow them wherever they go. One officer, interrogated after the war, admitted bitterly, "We had tanks that could fight. They had trucks that could win." The difference was profound. German strategy assumed that if they could inflict enough casualties, destroy enough tanks, or hold key cities long enough, the Allies would falter. What they had not foreseen was the American obsession with supply, an obsession so relentless that even as battles raged, convoys moved, unstoppable as tides. For the men driving, heroism looked different. There were no medals pinned for dodging potholes or changing tires in the rain, but survival often depended on their stubbornness. Trucks carried more than crates, they carried trust. Infantrymen in foxholes spoke of our trucks, the way others spoke of comrades. Pilots grounded for lack of fuel cursed the skies until the supply convoys arrived. And when tanks ran dry, it was the low, rattling engine of a Deuce-and-a-Half that restored their roar. Consider one autumn evening near the Belgian border. Rain hammered down, and a convoy carrying fuel became bogged on a muddy incline. Engines roared, wheels spun, and time bled away. Without that fuel, the armored divisions ahead would grind to a halt. Drivers leapt from cabs, sloshing knee-deep in muck, pushing, straining, swearing, until slowly the trucks lurched forward, one by one, headlights carving into the downpour. Hours later, the fuel reached the tanks waiting in the mist. By dawn, those tanks rolled forward again, smashing through German lines that had counted on a pause. That night, faceless drivers had changed the fate of hundreds of men, though history rarely remembered their names. The Germans began to adapt, sending Luftwaffe fighters to strafe convoys, dispatching ambush squads to forest roads, planting mines along highways. Losses mounted. Trucks burned on the roadside, drivers killed in their seats, fuel barrels erupting into fireballs. Yet for every destroyed convoy, two more appeared. America's factories kept sending replacements, faster than destruction could keep pace. The Germans felt it like an avalanche. No matter how many trucks they struck, the tide never slowed. And always, the contrast grew sharper. German supply wagons creaked with horse-drawn loads, taking days to reach the front. American trucks, roaring in convoys hundreds long, covered the same distance overnight. German soldiers went hungry. American troops received hot meals in mess kits. German divisions sat stranded for want of gasoline. American armor surged forward, fueled by convoys that seemed endless. It was a battle fought not with bullets but with movement, and every day the Americans pushed the frontier of that movement farther east. Behind the glamour of tanks and planes, behind the headlines of liberation, the real war was being waged by trucks. Their wheels wrote the story of victory across Europe. By late 1944, the German command could no longer laugh at what they had once dismissed. Reports from the field described an enemy advance that seemed powered by an invisible force. Tanks appeared where they should have run dry, artillery fired when it should have been silent, and infantry seemed to march endlessly without starvation or collapse. That invisible force was the truck, convoys pouring across the continent, linking ports, depots, and battlefronts in a web so dense that even the best German tacticians struggled to comprehend it. The scale itself was terrifying. More than 6,000 vehicles at a time thundered down the roads of France, each one a moving artery of the Allied body. Fuel flowed like blood, ammunition like muscle, food like breath. Destroy one artery, and another surged to take its place. The German army, once proud of its lightning warfare, now found itself outmaneuvered by something far simpler: persistence. Blitzkrieg had been a flash of fire. The American truck was a constant flame. To soldiers on the ground, the Red Ball Express became a symbol of reliability. An infantryman in Luxembourg later recalled how, after days of rain and combat, he heard the distant rumble of engines. It was like the sound of salvation, he said. We didn't care if it was tanks or trucks. When we heard wheels, we knew we weren't forgotten. That sentiment echoed across the front. Trucks carried not only supplies but morale. Each delivery was proof that the vast machine of war had not abandoned them, that they remained part of an army moving with unstoppable purpose. The Germans, meanwhile, faced the slow starvation of their war machine. Horses, once marked by Allied propaganda, still hold the bulk of their supplies. In mud, they faltered. In snow, they froze. When Allied air power targeted their columns, the horses panicked, leaving carts overturned and food spoiled in the ditches. What little mechanized transport they had was hobbled by fuel shortages. German tanks stood silent in forests, their crews waiting for gasoline that never came. Even when victories were possible, their engines betrayed them. One general confessed bitterly after the war, "Our tanks were lions. But lions starve when there is no meat." Contrast defined the struggle. On one side, young American drivers pushing battered trucks across Europe with fuel, ammunition, and food. On the other, German soldiers waiting in futility for supplies that never arrived. The difference was not glamorous. It was not the stuff of propaganda posters, but it was decisive. The Red Ball Express, however, was no easy miracle. Drivers faced relentless fatigue, accidents, and constant danger. Convoys roared at breakneck speeds to maintain momentum, engines straining as they hauled 5 tons of cargo over mountain passes and through ruined towns. Sleep-deprived men sometimes crashed into ditches or overturned on curves. Mechanics worked endlessly to patch up battered vehicles, scavenging parts from wrecks, welding frames back together with sparks flying in the night. The roads themselves bore scars, deep ruts carved into the earth from the endless weight of supply. French villagers remembered the thunder of tires, a sound that never seemed to cease. Yet despite every hardship, the trucks kept moving. That relentlessness unnerved the Germans more than any single weapon. For in war, a weapon could be countered, a tank destroyed, a plane shot down, a fortress captured. But how could one counter an endless tide of wheels? Every time a German officer planned a counterattack, it was undone not by superior firepower, but by the realization that the Allies simply had more. More fuel, more shells, more food, and more men carried forward by trucks that refused to rest. By the time winter approached, the Allied advance had slowed not because of German resistance, but because even the trucks struggled to keep up with the scale of liberation. Europe was vast, the roads treacherous, and the appetite of war endless. Still, what had once been ridiculed as fragile delivery vans had already become the backbone of victory. The Germans had underestimated the quiet, persistent power of logistics. They had mistaken simplicity for weakness. And that mistake was proving fatal. Winter descended on Europe with a cruelty that spared no army. Snow blanketed forests, rivers froze, and soldiers huddled in foxholes against the biting wind. For the Allies, the season tested not only their endurance but their supply system. Trucks, designed for mud and rain, now struggled on icy roads. Engines refused to start in the cold. Tires slid across frozen highways, and convoys stalled when drifts buried entire routes. Yet even in this hostile landscape, the Red Ball Express refused to stop. Drivers wrapped blankets around themselves, lit fires beneath fuel tanks to coax engines to life, and pushed forward into the blizzards. This perseverance reached its climax in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. The German army, desperate for one last strike, hurled its remaining strength into the Ardennes. Panzer divisions punched through American lines, aiming to split the Allies in two. Surprise and ferocity carried them forward. For a moment, the old spectre of Blitzkrieg seemed reborn. But Blitzkrieg had always relied on fuel, and fuel was now the German army's scarcest resource. Their gamble depended on capturing Allied depots. When that failed, their advance slowed, sputtered, and finally stalled. Tanks sat abandoned in snowy fields, their engines silent, their crews retreating on foot. Meanwhile, American trucks became the unsung heroes of the Ardennes. The winter roads were perilous, yet convoys kept supplies moving to encircled units. Drivers braved artillery fire and Luftwaffe strafing runs, steering through snowstorms with blackout headlights. Fuel deliveries kept tanks alive long enough to counterattack. Ammunition loads sustained the defenders of Bastogne when the town was nearly cut off. One driver later recalled, "We weren't soldiers with rifles, but if our trucks didn't get through, Bastogne was lost." History remembered the stand of the 101st Airborne, but behind their defiance was the rumble of trucks carrying hope into a frozen hell. The contrast with German forces could not have been sharper. Their spearheads ran dry within days. Entire divisions ground to a halt not because they were defeated in battle, but because their supply lines collapsed. Horses struggled in the snow, their breath freezing in the air as they dragged carts through drifts. Without fuel, tanks became steel coffins. Without food, soldiers scavenged in villages, stealing what little the civilians had left. What the German High Command had dismissed as mundane logistics now revealed itself as the very difference between survival and collapse. For the Americans, the Ardennes proved the ultimate vindication of the supply truck. A weapon without guns had outlasted tanks bristling with cannons. The German gamble had been bold, but it had underestimated the quiet resilience of wheels on icy roads. When the weather cleared and Allied air power returned, the end was sealed. The convoys had bought enough time, delivered enough fuel, and carried enough supplies to turn the tide. By January 1945, the offensive was broken. The last hope of the Reich had bled out in snowdrifts, undone as much by logistics as by bullets. After the Bulge, the advance across Europe became unstoppable. The same trucks that had slogged through rain and snow now roared across the Rhine, carrying the lifeblood of an army on the march to final victory. German generals, once proud of their mechanized blitz, now stared in disbelief at reports of Allied mobility. It was not tanks that haunted them, but the endless rumble of supply convoys that never ceased, day or night, storm or sun. The irony was bitter. What they had once marked as fragile delivery vans had become the very force that buried them. The American truck, underestimated and overlooked, had proven itself the true engine of victory. When the war finally ended in 1945, Europe stood in ruins, and armies that had once seemed invincible lay broken. The Jeep, the Sherman, the bomber, all became symbols of Allied power. Yet for those who fought and those who remembered, another image lingered. The endless columns of trucks, headlights glowing in the dusk, rolling toward the front without pause. They were not glamorous. They were not celebrated in parades, but they had carried victory on their wheels. Soldiers wrote home about them. Farmers in liberated villages recalled the sight of convoys rushing past, engines growling, drivers waving as they tossed rations to hungry children. Veterans, decades later, still remembered the sound of tires on broken roads, a rhythm of reassurance in the chaos of war. For them, those trucks were more than steel and rubber. They were survival itself. German officers who had once scoffed at supply trucks were left with a bitter lesson. They had believed that wars were won by tanks, by planes, by sheer firepower. Instead, they learned that wars are decided by what keeps those machines moving: the fuel, the food, the ammunition carried by convoys that never rest. Simplicity had defeated complexity. What they marked as weakness had revealed itself as strength. And so the story of the supply truck endures, a reminder etched into history's quiet margins. In every great conflict, it is easy to remember the battles, the generals, the weapons. But behind them all, there are always wheels turning, engines humming, and ordinary men driving through the night. They are the unseen giants of war, and in 1944, they changed the fate of Europe.